The world around us is not static and 2D. It moves and flows around us, and we live and move through it. And as photographers, one of the things that we're trying to achieve is to capture this world through our own vision, through our own eyes. And all of this activity that happens around us, it is possible to capture this within our phones. And we can also use this to become creative and use our skills to show the world in our own unique perspective. We can add motion, we can capture this depth of this world that is living all around us. So in this lesson, I'm going to show you how to take advantage of motion and depth to get even more creative with your photography and realize your vision. My name is William Eames, and welcome back to the Smartphone Photography course. Now, just the usual quick little bit of housekeeping to get through. As always, you should know the drill well enough at this stage. You can attend via the website through our 1 hour reminders, and at this stage I hope you've also downloaded the app. But as I've mentioned before, most importantly, if you're struggling to keep up with the lessons, please do remember you can watch the recordings, you can change your class date and time, and you can even restart your entire course schedule if needs be. We want to make sure that you attend every lesson. So if you are struggling to watch the lessons, you can have these options here. But you can also reach out to us at support@shawacademy.com, and we will certainly endeavour to find a way for you to complete your lessons. Now let's get into this lesson. We're only covering 2 topics in lesson number 4, which is motion and depth, but it's a jam-packed lesson. There is an awful lot of information, as controlling motion and depth is one of the key things to getting more advanced with our photography, because we're going to be discussing shutter speeds, we're going to be discussing apertures, and these are going to really take your photography to the next level and begin to set your work apart from all of that other work and all of that other photography that we experience every single day. So we're going to kick things off by having a look at shutter speeds and motion, exactly what shutter speeds are and how they control motion. Just some common terms to get familiar with, covering both shutter speed and aperture. We're going to be talking about shutter speeds themselves, frozen movement and blurred movement. We'll have a look at camera shake, how you can avoid that. We'll also have a look then later on in the lesson at our apertures again. We'll speak about f-stops, how they control shallow depth of field and deep depth of field, and how you can achieve shallow depth of field using your smartphones. So first off, just a quick refresher on our shutter speed. So shutter speed controls time. It controls the duration of time that the sensor is exposed to light, and it controls motion and can blur and freeze movement. It is electronic. The sensor determines how long the exposure is, unlike in a camera where you might have what's called a focal plane shutter, which is actually like a curtain that sits just above the sensor, and that controls the amount of time. But in our phones, because they're so much smaller, it's simply an electronic thing that happens. The sensor determines how long the exposure is, and it can be controlled in pro and manual mode, which we're going to have a look at later on in this lesson. Otherwise, the camera will determine it in auto mode. Now, shutter speed and aperture are both key components of our exposure triangle. Okay, so shutter speed determines how long the exposure is created within the phone. Too much time and the exposure is going to be too bright. Too little time and the exposure is going to be underexposed. This is balanced off with the aperture. Now, as we know, the aperture cannot be changed within our phones. So using our phones, it's more a case of time and sensitivity, the shutter speed and the ISO, that are going to be working together to maintain a correct exposure. But we will work up to that throughout this and later lessons. So to quickly summarize shutter speeds, the length of time that the shutter is open is known as the shutter speed. If we need more light, the shutter will be open for a longer duration. So for example, we're photographing at night, the shutter speed is going to be slower because we need more light. If we need less light, the shutter will be open for a shorter duration. So if it's midday, it's very, very sunny, the shutter will be open for a much shorter duration, and shutter speeds are measured and will appear in the settings as seconds and fractions of a second. So you're going to see seconds are most likely fractions of a second. So shutter speeds control exposure, but they also control motion. So the secondary effect from a long and a short shutter speed is the effect that it has on motion and movement. So when we use a slower shutter speed, we're going to get more blur. When we use a faster shutter speed, we're going to freeze that motion even more. So say, for example, I'm photographing at a quarter of a second. You can see here the cyclists now, there's lots of movement here, there's lots of blurred motion here because they're cycling very, very fast, and I'm using a slow shutter speed. Or in the second option here, I'm using a much faster shutter speed, 250th of a second. The cyclists are frozen as they are cycling very, very fast. Now, a quarter of a second may not seem that slow to us, but in terms of light, in terms of time, it is very, very slow. So light, obviously, the fastest thing that we are aware of. So a quarter of a second is quite slow in terms of light. So while it might seem very fast to us, it is quite slow as a shutter speed. So let's have a look at the most common shutter speeds available to us. Now, I say the most common, you will certainly see a lot more shutter speeds on your phones than this. But as you can see with these particular shutter speeds, each one of them is half the speed compared to the one in front of it. So for example, a quarter of a second, the one beside it then is an eighth of a second, which is much faster. 15th of a second, not exactly a half, but close enough. 15th to a 30th to a 60th. And each time we go up to a faster shutter speed, we are reducing the light by half. Okay, so slower shutter speeds means more light, it means more blur and motion. Faster shutter speeds, less light, less blur and motion. So moving like this from, again, example, 125th of a second to 250th of a second, we are reducing the light by half every time we increase the shutter speed. Now, it is possible, as I said, that your phone is going to display far more speeds than this. There are smaller increments that we can increase and decrease our shutter speeds, but these are the ones that historically through photography have been used and then are known as common shutter speeds. Now, again, your cameras probably have a bigger range than this available as well. Some phones go all the way up to 24,000th of a second, which is incredibly fast as well. Now, to balance this off too, your ISO will adjust. So when you're photographing using shutter speed, I recommend to start with to use an auto ISO setting so that the camera will handle that aspect of it for you until we get to the stage where we're controlling that ourselves. Now, when you're photographing and you're using the manual mode or the pro mode, whatever happens to be called on your phone, you may notice that it actually uses an aperture symbol when setting the shutter speed. So this symbol is typically associated with an aperture. So why is it being used when we're talking about shutter speeds on our phones? Well, it's to do with what's known as a leaf shutter. So certain cameras, large format cameras in particular, but also some medium format cameras as well, like Hasselblad's, they actually have the shutter located within the lens as part of the aperture mechanism as well. So the two happen at the same time. You would be setting your aperture and then you set your shutter speed, and the leaf shutter closes and opens up again to allow the light to pass through. All at the same time, we've also set our aperture as well. In standard cameras, we have what's called a focal plane shutter, which is actually in the camera body itself and sits just above the image sensor. Now, in our phones, it all happens on the image sensor itself, but the reason that they use that symbol is that it's based on a leaf shutter, which is why it looks like an aperture symbol. So there you go. There is an interesting bit of trivia for you as well, and I hope it's cleared up why we use that symbol when photographing using shutter speeds on our smartphones. Now, coming back to our shutter speeds, let's have a look at some real life examples of how to set shutter speeds. So say, for example, here we have a motorcyclist moving very, very fast, but as we can see, has been more or less frozen here, is quite static in the shot. As we can see, lots and lots of detail here as well. A tiny little bit of movement, but more or less very, very sharp. So in an instance like this, a fast shutter speed would have been used. We would have set the shutter speed somewhere in and around 500 of a second. Now we can't know for sure exactly what shutter speed was used, but we know that it is a fast shutter speed because the motorcyclist has been frozen in motion. So we can make an educated guess that it's going to be somewhere in a high shutter speed, something like 500 of a second. Now let's have a look at if we were to use a slower shutter speed. So here in this instance we're using a much slower shutter speed, a 15th of a second in this case, and now we can see that the motorcyclist is blurred. So what is happening here in this 15th of a second? Well, at the beginning of the exposure, the motorcyclist was placed here. So when we first pressed the exposure button and the camera's sensor reacted to light, this motorcyclist was here. But by the end of the exposure, the motorcyclist had moved this amount of space in that 1/15th of a second. So that's why we get that blur. So this is the movement during the exposure. A 15th of a second, again, may seem very, very fast. To us, in terms of light, it is quite slow. And that is why we get that movement, that blurred movement, because during that duration of time, the motorcyclist moved throughout the exposure. Now, so with the ability to change shutter speeds, you have two new decisions that you can make with your photography. Do you want to blur motion with a slow speed and, for example, like this waterfall here, capture nice, smooth, silky water? Or do you want to freeze motion with a fast speed and capture all the fine granular details in a shot? And these are two new creative decisions you can make when you control shutter speeds. So how exactly do you control shutter speeds? Well, it's very straightforward. You go into the pro mode on your phones, and as I mentioned before, sometimes it is also known as manual mode, and it will give you control over your shutter speed and over your ISO. As you can see here very, very clearly, and on this particular phone, we can see our ISO, we can see our shutter speed with that aperture symbol. We can see it's set to 500 of a second, but it goes all the way up to 24,000 of a second. And we have our f-stop, which is a fixed f-stop of f1.5, which is very wide in particular for this phone. So you can set it there, and as I mentioned, when you're photographing in using your shutter speeds, do check if you have an auto mode for your ISO to let the phone handle that for now while you get familiar with changing shutter speeds. And when you do begin to change your shutter speeds, you can start making decisions then, for example, using fast shutter speeds for action and sports to achieve photographs like this, where you can see all of the droplets, all of the detail there in the water. That's because a very, very fast shutter speed has been used. And with the ability to be able to go all the way up to 24,000 of a second, that's much faster than even a DSLR is able to capture. So you can get very, very fast photographs indeed using your phones. Now you can also, of course, use it for wildlife photography as well to capture incredible action shots like this. Now, just something to be aware of though, if you are doing this type of photography, you happen to be using a telephoto lens, remember you're going to need a very fast shutter speed to avoid camera shake. When we zoom in, when we use an increased focal length, our shutter speeds become more susceptible to camera shake. So you have to keep those shutter speeds very, very high to make sure that you do not get camera shake when using telephoto lenses. When you're using slow speeds, you can get very, very creative. Think about how to use your slow speeds. Slow speeds can be used to convey a sense of energy, and like if you have a look at this photograph here, there's a real sense of business and activity going on. It can make the most mundane of situations become much, much more interesting. So for example, if you go to your local high street and loads of people rushing around, if you were to just capture that as a still image using a fast shutter speed, it might be a little bit boring. But if you were to use a slow shutter speed, introduce a little bit of movement and blur, it really adds energy to the scene. And slow shutter speeds can be used for our landscape photography as well to get that really nice silky effect on the water. You will absolutely need to use a tripod to do something like this, or just put the phone somewhere where it keeps nice and steady. And you may also need to use what's known as a neutral density filter, which is something we'll be speaking about in the next lesson to reduce your exposure time even more. But it is also something to try out and to think about with your landscape photography if you ever wanted to get that kind of smooth, almost misty looking effect to the water. And of course, we can use slow shutter speeds for doing much longer exposures like this type of image here. We can use it for light painting, for capturing light trails. We'll have a look at how to do this in lesson number 7. Now, one thing you do need to be very careful of when using slower shutter speeds is camera shake. And this is perhaps the biggest cause of unsharp photographs. I always get students asking me, how do I focus better? I keep getting photographs that are out of focus and blurry. And the majority of the time, it has nothing to do with your focusing, it's to do with your shutter speed. So you need to be very, very careful with camera shake. Generally, anything that's less than a 60th of a second, I should say, will give you camera shake. But many phones are very advanced nowadays and have what are called optical image stabilizers, which will help to steady the image somewhat more when using slower shutter speeds. But do just pay attention to the shutter speed that you are using, and if you're finding that you're getting camera shake, take another photograph and just try to remain even steadier. Of course, what's going to really help here is a little tripod. As I mentioned before, and I'll just keep saying it again, it's one of the best investments that you can make as a photographer. As you can see here, very small enough that it could nearly fit in your pocket, so that you can bring it around with you. Just place it down on something, a ledge or a wall or something like that, and you'll be able to get the shot without getting the risk of camera shake. And this is going to be essential really if you want to do long exposure nighttime photography. Now, the final thing for now to do with our shutter speeds is something very fun, which is called panning. So as you can see here in the photograph on the phone, we've got a runner. She's running at quite a high speed. We can see that she's mostly sharp. We can see her legs, they're captured in movement, but the background is very blurred and it looks very fast. And this is because the photographer is moving, matching the speed of the subject. So as the subject is moving, you tracking along with the subject and taking different exposures to capture this type of movement effect. Shutter speeds around the 60th or slower will be enough, but as I mentioned, you need to be careful of shutter speed. A tripod will help keep the shot steady, and sitting or crouching will also help to keep things steady at those shutter speeds as well. And try to choose an interesting background too, otherwise the effect is not going to really be captured. Now, when you're doing this as well, it is also recommended to use autofocus continuous. We had a look at this back in a previous lesson where it'll constantly track and follow your subject. So you can just be panning along with the subject, not having to worry about the focusing, just pressing that exposure button with a slightly slower shutter speed so that it will capture that nice panned movement for you as well. So there's lots of things there now that you can try with your shutter speed. You can blur motion, you can freeze motion, you can try and pan along as well, or you can also try your hand at doing a long exposure to capture those light trails, but we'll have a look at how to do that properly in lesson number 7. Now, so moving away from our shutter speeds for now, we'll certainly be coming back to them in the next lesson and going on, but it's time to move on to our apertures. And let me ask you a question. This is a tough one, but I want you to ask me what you think is the f-stop range for our eyes. Is it f1 to f16, f2 to f8.3, f3.5 to f5.6, or f4 to f11? Now, probably no surprise, the answer will be revealed at the end of the lesson. But when I speak about the range, I mean, so when our pupils dilate to let more light into, when they get smaller, when they constrict to stop the flow of light, what do you think the equivalent f-stop range is for our eyes? It is a tricky question. Multiple choice there pretty much. Maybe you already know what the answer is, but don't look it up. Don't look it up and we'll see at the end of the lesson. Okay, So of course you can interact using Morpheus as usual. Any questions that you have, please interact here, chat with Morpheus, and keep rating those responses so that we can continually improve them. And I do look at them, and myself and the team here, we all have looked at the responses there to constantly be updating them and to make them much more accurate for the types of questions that you are asking. Now, so moving on to our second topic, it is time to talk about apertures and depth of field. And certainly we've spoken plenty about apertures already throughout this course, but just a very, very quick recap on some of the more important points regarding our apertures. We know that the aperture controls the volume of light coming into the photograph. So it's actually in the lens. It allows light to pass through and reach the through the image sensor. It comes in different sizes depending on the phone and is measured in f-stops or f-numbers, for example, f2.2, f2.4 and so on, which are probably the most common f-stops when it comes to our phones. And it also controls depth of field. It controls, whether we're using a deep depth of field where everything is nice and sharp and in focus, or whether, like in this portrait here, we have nice shallow, blurry, out of focus depth of field. But the biggest limitation that we have with our phones is it cannot be changed, unlike on a camera. So this makes capturing depth of field a little bit trickier, especially when it comes to shadow depth of field. Now, your pupils, as I mentioned, will change depending on the light available. So we understand that when there's not a lot of light available, that the iris opens up to allow light to pass through, and that when it's constricted, less light passes through, and that our apertures work in the exact same way. Okay, but we have a fixed aperture. We cannot change the aperture setting, so it makes achieving depth of field tricky. And that, as I mentioned before, it is still possible, and that is what we're going to explore. Now, the thing to remember with f-stops is that the higher the number, the smaller the opening on the lens. Okay, so if you've got a very high aperture number, it doesn't mean that you're going to have more light. It means you're going to have less light. So if we're trying to achieve a shallow depth of field, or if you want more light, you should be looking at phones that have a low f-stop number. Okay, so just a quick recap of things that we have already covered. But I'm sure you're probably wondering at this stage, what does the F stand for? So where does an f-stop come from? What does it mean? Well, it's quite complex. The F stands for focal, as in the focal length of the lens. So we had to look at the focal length back in lesson number 2, how that's calculated. It's the distance in the lens where the image comes into focus, measured from the image sensor. The f-stop is calculated by the focal length, by the opening of the aperture compared to that focal length. So, for example, if we had a 50mm lens with an f2 aperture, I divide 2 into 50mm, that gets me 25mm. This means 25mm is actually the size of the aperture opening. Now, that's all quite complex. It's all very mathematical. Does it help with your photography? Probably not really, not at this stage, but now you know where the F comes from and what it means. What we really need to understand is the effect that it has on our photographs. A lower aperture number is going to give us a wider aperture, meaning a shallower depth of field. Okay, so let's have a look at how to achieve depth of field using our phone. So the first is the aperture. The focal length is going to be very important. The camera to subject distance is going to be vital. And then the subject to background distance is also going to be very, very important in achieving shallow depth of field. Now, there's two types of depth of field that we aim to achieve with our photography. The first is a deep depth of field, which is typically used, but not exclusively, with landscape photography. Like we can see here in this example, we have a very sharp foreground and very sharp middle ground and a very sharp background. So everything in the photograph is nice and sharp because we are using a deep depth of field. This is great for things like architectural photography as well. Anything that we're trying to have the viewer's attention go through the entire photograph. So a deep depth of field, this is quite easy to achieve with our phones because they're geared up to capture deep depth of field as it is, because they try to keep everything sharp. Okay, so when we talk about landscape photography in the next lesson, achieving a deep depth of field is going to be a lot easier than achieving a shallow depth of field, which is where we only have a small portion of the photograph in focus. A shallow depth of field, we have a blurred out foreground or a blurred out background. And depth of field extends about 1/3 in front of the subject to about 2/3 behind it. We'll visualize that a little bit more later on in the lesson. But this is what's much more difficult to achieve when we're using our phones. Now, there is a certain kind of logic to it though, because typically with a landscape photograph, we're not going to aim to get a shallow depth of field. In fact, it's not really possible to get a shallow depth of field in a landscape photograph unless we're focusing specifically on something in the foreground. So usually when we're aiming for a shallow depth of field, it is for photographs where we're doing kind of a macro photograph, say product or food photography, or for a portrait. And this is something that we can achieve with our smartphones because there's a lot to do about distance. Now, while I'm on the subject of landscapes, I just want to give you a very quick preview as to what is coming up in the next lesson, which is all about our landscape photography. So we're going to have a look at how we can capture better landscapes through our phones. And it's not just a case of aiming for a deep depth of field. Going to talk all about where you should be photographing, what times you should be photographing at, and very importantly, we're also going to have a look at how to avoid getting overexposure, which is something that's very common when we photograph landscapes. So do join me for that lesson. Now, of course, as well, our skills are really progressing. This is definitely one of the more difficult lessons. So we have added quite a lot of skills in terms of our technical ability. Our vocabulary is now past the halfway point. So we're flying with all of these new words, and our advanced skills are also taking a bit of a jump in this lesson as well. So keep going until we fill up all of those abilities, all of those skills. Now, so jumping back into our lesson. So to really understand depth of field, we need to understand what the plane of focus is, which is a very simple concept. The plane of focus is simply the distance from the camera where the image is sharpest. It's where we focus on. It's the part in the photograph where we choose to focus on, and depth of field would extend from this point. So as you can see here in this example, we've got this very particular place in the image that's nice and sharp. Everything that's in front of it and behind it is out of focus due to the depth of field. So that sharp point is the plane of focus. It's simply the point where we've chosen to focus in the photograph. So here we've got a fairly crude illustration of how it works, but it should give you an idea. So we have our smartphone. We're taking a photograph of a tree. So we focus on the tree. So we choose to focus on the tree, and that is our plane of focus. Okay, so the plane of focus extends from our point of focus, and depth of field then extends from this point of focus. Now, depth of field, as I mentioned earlier, extends from about 1/3 in front of the subject to about 2/3 behind the subject. It'll always be somewhere in that ratio, no matter how far or how close we are to the subject. Let's have a look at another example of it. So say, for example, we're photographing flowers. We're trying to do something more along the lines of a macro shot. We have quite a deep depth of field in this particular case. As we can see from our plane of focus, it's extending out from about 1/3 in front of the subject to about 2/3 behind it. Now, if I was to get closer to the subject, now we get a shallow depth of field. The closer I get to my subject, the depth of field becomes more shallow. Now, it still extends from about 1/3 in front of the subject to about 2/3 behind the subject, but as you can see, it is much, much shallower compared to the previous image. So if I was just to go back there, we can see that when I'm further away from my subject, that we have a much more extended deep depth of field. But if I get in closer, that depth of field becomes much more shallow. Okay, let's have a look at some more examples of this. So here we've got 3 people at 3 different distances, and we're photographing all of these with the same aperture setting on our smartphones. Okay, so if we have a look at the first one, we focus on our person here, We've got our plane of focus there, and the depth of field extends, as we've established, about 1/3 in front of the subject to about 2/3 behind it. Everything else that's in the green here remains out of focus. It's out of that depth of field range, so it appears nice and blurry. If my subject is standing further away, that depth of field is going to extend a little bit further. Now again, it's still about 1/3 in front of the subject to about 2/3 behind the subject, but its range has gotten much deeper. Now again, we've still got an area far off into the distance that is out of focus, is nice and shallow. But then in the final image, keep in mind we're using the exact same aperture in all of these, our plane of focus is much further away from the camera, so that means that everything behind the subject is going to be sharp. Okay, we still have a part in front of the very foreground, which you probably wouldn't see in the photograph, but everything beyond that is going to be nice and sharp. So when you're photographing landscapes, because our landscapes are typically very far away, we're focusing on something quite far away, that is why we get a nice, sharp, deep depth of field. But when we are photographing portraits, the closer we are to our subject, the smaller that depth of field is going to be, which is what gives us that nice, shallow depth of field effect. So that's depth of field in theory. Now, when we're photographing using a camera with a lens that we have an option to change the aperture on, it is possible for us to maintain the same distance and simply change the aperture to get different depth of field effects. When using our phones, obviously it's going to be a little bit more of compromise, and we're going to have to do a little bit of moving around. So say, for example, in this instance, we've got a group of people lined up. We're photographing, for just in this instance, for the sake of argument, we've got a phone that has an aperture of f2.8. We're quite close. We're focusing on the gentleman here in the front, with the briefcase, and it extends to the lady. The depth of field extends to the lady here in the middle, but we're losing people in the background. Because we're quite close to our subject, that depth of field range just simply doesn't extend any further than that. So to get everybody into focus, the photographer needs to take a step back. And that will increase that depth of field effect, that depth of field area. We're still focusing on the gentleman here in the front, but then we're able to get those other people in the background nice and sharp. Now there is other ways as well. So depth of field would extend around the person or the object that we're focusing on. So say, for example, with this lineup of people, as we can see in this instance, the photographer has focused on the girl here, second in row, and everyone in front of her and behind her is nice and out of focus with that shallow depth of field. Because where we choose to focus from is where the depth of field extends from, because of that plane of focus. So, of course, we can change our focusing by using our different focusing modes, but in this instance, AFS, autofocus single, is probably going to be our best bet, because we can simply press on the person or the object that we want to be in focus, and as I mentioned then, the depth of field is going to extend from around that person. So let's have a look at this again. So here we've got our lineup again. Our photographer is focused on the gentleman in front. Nice shallow depth of field here. He's quite close to the subject, so he's in focus. Everyone else behind him is out of focus. Now say he shifts his focus then to the gentleman standing behind him. So he's now changed his focus by using the AF focus, simply pressed on the face of the gentleman behind him, and now the depth of field extends from that gentleman. And that means that the person in front of him is now out of focus. And he could continue all along this line by simply changing his focus, because the depth of field will extend around that person. Now, again, you need to be quite close to your subject to achieve this, or you can also change the type of lens that you're using. So lenses will also have an impact on this as well. So we looked at different lenses back in lesson 2. If you were to use, say, a telephoto lens, because telephoto lens will get you closer to the subject, you could be using a telephoto lens instead without having to physically get closer into your subject. So just to basically summarize how you can achieve depth of field on your smartphone. As I've established, get closer. Get as close as possible to your subject as you can. So you can do this by physically moving in closer. And as I mentioned, usually if you're photographing something where you're aiming for a shallow depth of field, it is something that you're going to be able to get in close on, whether it's flowers, whether it's a person, whether it's something you're trying to do some kind of macro photography, food, etc. Just get it in physically closer using your lens. Zoom in using optical zoom. So if you have a smartphone that has the option, the ability to zoom in using an optical zoom, this is a great advantage. It means that you can zoom in and make that distance even closer than if you were using a fixed lens. Now, don't use digital zoom. You won't be able to achieve a depth of field effect by using digital zoom. It just, remember, you're only zooming in on pixels using the digital zoom. It doesn't work the same way. So if you have an optical zoom, brilliant. Use that to your advantage and get that shallow depth of field. Telephoto lenses are great for this as well. Also portrait lenses as well. We had a look at these attachments back in lesson number 2. And again, as I mentioned before, telephoto lenses are great for portraits because they can achieve that shallow depth of field. So it means that you can reduce that distance between you and your subject while maintaining a distance away from them, so you can get nice candid shots. So for example, if you're doing wildlife photography, it means that you can maintain a distance away from your subject but still have the ability to achieve a nice shallow depth of field by using a telephoto lens. Change where you focus. So obviously focus on your subject to make sure that they're in focus, and then everything else behind them should be nice and shallow and out of focus. So it's a bit of an obvious one, but simply change where you focus. And as I said with the lineup, if you choose to focus on someone a little bit further back in the image, you should get a nice shallow depth of field in the foreground of the image as well. And move your subject away from the background. So if you're trying to obtain a shallow depth of field and your subject is standing right next to a wall, you're simply not going to get that shallow depth of field. There's not enough room to get that shallow depth of field. So you want to have your subject in a position where there's lots of space, lots of room behind them, so that you can get that nice shallow depth of field effect. And that's going to be important then as well when we're trying to achieve what's known as bokeh, which I know some of you have probably been asking about in this lesson. Well, we will have a look at how to get bokeh in our portrait photography lesson number 6. So don't worry about it for now. We just need to get familiar with depth of field first of all. But moving your subject away from the background gives them space behind where you can get that nice fall off and that nice shallow depth of field effect. And we also have apps that can recreate that depth of field effect as well. Obviously, it's not going to be as good quality as if we were to achieve it in the camera, but it is possible to get apps that will help us to create that blurry out of focus effect. And again, we'll speak about those apps at a later stage. So a lot to take in this lesson, very tricky lesson. We will certainly be coming back to shutter speeds and apertures as we continue on throughout the course, because they're still going to play very important roles at different stages when we're trying to achieve different types of photographs. But I think we've kind of covered enough that we need to know for this stage. Now, coming back to the question that I asked earlier on, what is the f-stop range in our eyes? And well, I know it was a very, very tough question, but if you said option number 2, f2.8 to f8.3, you're absolutely right. So this is the range that we have, estimated range that we have when it comes to our eyes, our pupils, for their f-stop. So f2 in the dark to around f8.3 in bright situations. Okay, so again, just another bit of trivia for you to know. If there's ever a photography pub quiz, you're going to absolutely know every single answer. Now, so looking forward then to our next lesson number 5. We're going to talk all about landscapes. We're going to have a look at how you can get really stunning landscapes. We're going to talk about using accessories like neutral density filters. We'll talk about when and where is the best time to photograph, the approaches that you should take. And importantly, we're going to have a look at making sure that you get correct exposures as well. How you can learn to read what your phone is telling you to make sure that you don't get an image that's overexposed or underexposed too. So do join me for that lesson. Even if you have no interest in landscape photography, it's still going to be a very, very important lesson to help you to master your phones. So Thank you so much for joining me. Well done on completing lesson number 4. And remember to rate the lesson and give me any feedback, any suggestions that you may have had throughout the lesson. And of course, your challenge, I want you to display 2 photographs this time, using an example of shutter speed and another using an example of depth of field. Shaw Smart Photo on Twitter and Instagram. You can tag us on Facebook as well at Shaw Smart Photo. And again, thank you so much for everybody who's been participating in the challenges so far. They are optional, but I do recommend that you try them out because it'll help you to get familiar and to understand everything that we are covering within these lessons. So thank you once again for joining me. Well done on completing lesson number 4, and until next time, take care of yourselves, and I'll talk to you all again very soon. Bye for now.